Welcome back. This is our second lecture on Egypt. This is our Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom section. And so things are going to begin to change here a little bit. We have a movement away from the pyramids and into different funerary architecture and the construction of more elaborate temples as well. So we'll take a look at the sculpture to begin with, thinking about how the tradition stayed the same, even though our time period has changed really rather dramatically. We're now in the 12th dynasty, and the more that you look at the way that the figures, you can see these kind of conventions are holding up century after century. Notice the negative space between the arms and the side of the body not away. You see a little bit more development in some of the figures here that are made of different materials. The wooden figures and the smaller are a bit more likely to be carved in fully in the round, although these are a little unusual. You do have the crown of Upper Egypt, the red crown of Lower Egypt still being depicted. So we definitely have a little bit of a change in the proportions as well. You notice that the bodies have a little bit more figure in the Middle Kingdom. You often will find statues that have been defaced. Certainly some of these time, they could easily have been broken just from passage of time, but quite frequently a subsequent pharaoh would go deface the statuary of his predecessors and a way of establishing his own power. So you can see the damage here. We start to see tombs that are done in a very different way in the Middle Kingdom, and that's important for us to think about. The tradition of burying the king and the royal family in pyramids also does kind of create a spotlight that shows potential thieves. Treasure troves of gold and other luxury items are to be found, and so most of the tombs that we're aware of were in fact raided. So the movement away from the pyramid and into this new tradition is really kind of intriguing. The tombs begin to be carved into, and this is a tradition that then allows for a pretty remarkable level of architecture on the interior, but kind of plain exteriors that sort of hide and separate the tombs a little bit more than the predecessors would have done. These are tombs at Beni Hassan, rock-cut tombs. It is somewhat similar. We have hallways filled with columns, and that's going to become a highlight of Egyptian architecture going forward. In this case, what's really kind of fascinating is that those columns are not really structural, they're decorative, and you can see that here where this column's broken. Remember, all of what you're seeing here has been carved out of solid stone, so those columns are not supporting the roof per se. They are carved to look as if that is their function. Notice also with the tombs themselves, these carved columns have fluting. It's those shallow grooves that run the vertical height of those columns. You'll see fluted columns quite frequently in Greek architecture as well. Perhaps one of the most impressive of the mortuary temples is to the female pharaoh Hatsup. She absolutely was, as opposed to regent. Some female rulers of Egypt ruled while their children were too young to inherit the rather than pharaohs themselves. In fact, the Egyptians don't actually have a word for queen. They have a word for king's mother or king's wife. So Hatshepsut, when she comes to power, takes on the role of pharaoh, and in fact, she depicts statuary wearing the headdress associated with the pharaoh, wearing the false beard, all of the other symbols of power chested as well. It's kind of fascinating to see how she fits in to this very strict iconographic system of how the you can see that the funerary temple itself is not only her burial place, but ultimately is going to serve as a place to revere the gods. And so, in fact, a cult statue was brought to this space once a year, every year, for one night to be worshipped and then returned opposite side of the river. pretty remarkable. So you have Chapel of Hathor, you've got the temple to Hatsup herself, and temples to other of the pharaohs in her line. These are images of Hatshepsut herself, and you wouldn't necessarily her as female by any stretch of the imagination. She is a little bit more slender, which is something that begins to happen in that Middle Kingdom anyway, but you do see her in the guys using the false beard, the nimbus, the uraeus, all of those traditional garb are part of how she presents herself in her public sculpture. Some of the interesting things that you see in the second level of Hatshepsut's temple are these who are bringing gifts to the queen. And so you can see that there are some probably unflattering, probably intentionally unflattering depictions of other ethnicities there as well. It certainly helps differentiate them from the Egyptians and certainly from the queen herself. We definitely need the couple terms here from this particular. Your colonnade, you're going to see more and more colonnades as we go into the architecture of Greece and Rome. A long sequence of columns. See that happening here. The Egyptian columns sometimes are carved to have what we call a chamfer. They're beveled on their edges. So instead of coming to a 90-degree corner, and you can sort of detect that in this slide here. We also need the term facade. You're going to see more and more emphasis on these sloping wall faces of buildings, particularly the temple structures that begin to be built in ancient Egypt. One of the most interesting periods, although in Egyptian history, is the Amarna period. And this is a period during which the pharaoh chooses to follow a single god, changes his religion and tries to enforce that religion on the rest of Egypt. And going from a polytheistic to a monotheistic faith is really kind of a major shift. So it doesn't stick, it doesn't last for terribly long. But here you can see the pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who literally changes his name to showcase the fact that he's following a new sun god, Akhenaten. And Akhenaten is the name that he gave himself. Aten is the god that he is following, and he believes that Aten is the sole and only god. It's the only time really in Egyptian that you start to see the figure of the pharaoh, the royal family, begin to be a little more naturalized, a little softer, less rigid. They begin to look a little more truly human. What's kind of ironic about that is that it doesn't make the image of the pharaoh terribly flattering. He definitely has a little of a poochy belly here, and he certainly seems to be a little bit hippie. His body does kind of have an hourglass shape that we would almost read as female in definitely he's trying, I think, to emphasize his role as being different from the pharaohs that went before him, and that perhaps necessitates the change in the style. You could also read it, I suppose, as a religion in which there's only a single god and that a person has to that god, perhaps necessitates a sculpture or an art form that begins to be more personal, more individualistic. The Amarna period is so named because he moves his capital to Amarna, and the pharaoh's name again changes from Amenhotep to Akhenaten. His sculptural forms you can recognize really clearly by that kind of hourglass and the belly, especially in profile. When you see you can really see that that also includes a little bit of elongation. It almost looks alien in the shapes of the skulls. This is the king, this is Akhenaten, his queen Nefertiti, and their three daughters are depicted here as well. This piece is also kind of fascinating because it's part of funeral architecture for the pharaoh. This is in fact part of a altar that would have been in a private home. This is the people revering the god that the pharaoh has chosen, represented here by the sun disk, and it wears its own little uraeus. There's serpent there as well. And you can see that the rays of the sun terminate, at least the ones pointing at the pharaoh and at his bride, symbol of eternal life. So it's as if the sun is giving its godly power to the two heads of state. It's also kind of fascinating. The queen's throne is far more elaborate than her husband's, but you notice that they've all been depicted with this kind of little bit of a belly, kind of scrawny arms, elongated heads, but at the same time notice that they're beginning to behave more like real people. The children are kissing the parents or playing with the queen. They're pointing and gesturing and kind of making themselves more present than any of the children we've seen up to this point in Egyptian art. Perhaps the most remarkable image of the queen is the portrait bust there to the side. This piece was made by a sculptor who kept this original in his studio, and we believe that he was using it as his template to make other images of the queen. And so you can kind of get a sense of who she is as a real individual human being from that image. You notice that there's some damage. She's of her ear. That is perhaps damage from time, but what is most likely not damage is the difference in the two eyes. You notice the inlay is missing in this eye, and we believe that to be intentional on the part of the sculptor, kind of marking the original piece, so it's not for sale to be placed somewhere else, but it's his kind of record to return to, his kind of guide. What's also kind of wonderful about the piece is that it is stone, but it is covered in stucco or in plaster, and that plaster allows for very, very delicate molding around the lips and cheeks in particular. You might also say it's possible that he started with one version and then put the plaster on top to kind of beautify her. Perhaps. I think it's more likely that the plaster was applied really to begin to make the form of the muscles in the face and the neck more human. This is perhaps Egyptian art example that I can show you at this point, and it comes to us from the Amarna period. This is Akhenaten's mother, Tai, and she also has a more personal expression and a more specific, individualized face. If you look at her nose in particular, it's really impressive. You can see here Akhenaten's brother and his queen, and again, it is much more personalized. Notice that the skin the two figures are more similar to one another. This is a reproduction based on the original piece that you see to the left. It's a little easier to see in the reproduction, though. What's happening with the legs on the king's brother, he's not actually in profile anymore. He's actually in three-quarter view on an angle into the scene toward us, and his skirts are responding to the movement of his leg. We've not really seen this kind of naturalism in Egyptian art to this point. The Amarna period really comes to a crashing end with King Tut. The Amarna period of honoring really does change. Tut actually goes back to revering the god Amun-Ra, and that is much to the satisfaction of the Egyptian people. They're much more comfortable with their polytheistic, death-focused religion. And Tut himself is not terribly important in terms of political history. The reason we revere him so much is because his is one of the few tombs that was not raided. In fact, his tomb was not uncovered until after the Second World War and after much searching. But when it was unearthed, finally opened, the tomb was revealed to contain everything original to his burial. Nothing had been removed. And so those works were very, very carefully cataloged. They're owned by the Cairo Museum, but they did in fact tour the world so that people would be able to get a sense of Egyptian art styles and what the opulence of the life of the pharaohs was. It's also likely that his tomb, the number of treasures therein, is partially because the line of the pharaohs following Akhenaten cut short, and so things that might have gone to other members of that family would have been interred with Tut. You get the burial ritual from looking at the way the sarcophagus is laid out here. What's in the tomb at the moment is the stone sarcophagus, but inside there would be this nest of coffins inside of coffins. The first two are wood, and the innermost coffin is in solid gold. This gives you the outermost coffin compared to the second wooden coffin. You can see that Tut is himself with Osiris based on the crook and flail that he's holding. Remarkable to think that he not as successful or important to history as his predecessors that would still be buried with this level of glamour and treasure. The excavation really begins in earnest in 1922, so we only have about 100 years of research into time. It does give you a sense of how important it is to preserve history so that we're able to learn about the past. You can see the map on top of the mummy, and then the several coffin casings, one on top of the other, gold on top of gold on top of gold. This is the innermost coffin of Tut, and this is the one to know for the test. His funerary mask, made of hammered gold, has the Nemes and Uraeus, and of course the wooden false beard as well. And then this is the actual mummy itself. Pretty incredible. We definitely see a lot of painting in temples and in tombs, and there's still the hierarchy of scale. The standing figures are, of course, at a smaller scale than our more important seated figures here. But if you look at some of the less important, the musicians and dancers, they're allowed to be in positions and poses that allow for far more naturalism. So we do have this kind of in the formal, almost static, repetitive style that's applied to these, quote, important people who are meant to last forever, versus the humanity and individuality that we see in the lesser important figures. A very important rock-cut tomb for us to look at is the Temple of Ramses II. This particular piece, if you can believe it, was moved and very, very carefully reconstructed exactly as it should. It had to be moved to protect it from damage from the Aswan Dam Reservoir project. So those sculptures that you're seeing there are each to be the pharaoh. They're meant to represent Ramses. There's 4 of him seated across the entrance and more figures standing around them. The seated figures are 65 feet in height. Really pretty remarkable. The shapes on the interior, again, are carved from the stone itself. And so when it was first unearthed, you can see that they hadn't even been able to dig all the way down to the feet of these statues. When the columns are carved into representational statues of male or female figures, they have specific names. The Atlantids, the name that we give for male figures, Caryatids is the term for female carved figures. So there's our Atlantids that represent Ramses, and we'll see some columns carved to look like female characters or statues. Those are your Caryatids. Nefertari's tomb. She was one of the consorts of the king. You can certainly see Anubis and Horus are central to her in these paintings as well. This is from the Valley of the Queens. There's the god Thoth, of in terms of recording all events. He's a god of writing. And you can see that he is offering to Queen Nefertari the Ankh, symbol of eternal life. The temple structures that are now built can be, in fact, temples to the gods as opposed to places just to revere the pharaohs themselves. And quite frequently they are made up of these sloped, angled facades at their entrances, known as pylons, and then up of a series of columns. We can refer to those as colonnaded halls. Those colonnaded halls quite frequently will end with these remarkable capitals. These are known as the Papyrus Style, the ones that flare outward, and the ones that look more closed are known as the Bud Style capitals. Frequently, the taller columns in the center would raise the level of this roof to allow for light to pour in from the layer that we refer to as the clerestory. You'll see that term coming up again and again. Remember that, of course, these would have been painted, so these large hypostyle chambers or colonnaded chambers would really make you focus your attention upward and at that light pouring in from on high. It's kind of hard for us to imagine. This is to Amun-Re, the sun god. It's a temple not to a pharaoh that not only has carving all along the columns. Here you can see that papyrus. You can see the window area of the clerestory. Of course, the wooden ceiling's gone, but you can see here in this reconstruction how richly painted all this would have been. It's really pretty important for us also to recognize that sometimes the carving in relief causes the figure to be a depression in the surface as opposed to sticking out forward in relief. Your pylon is again your gateway, and that is the facade of the temple essentially. It generally side walls, which does echo the overall shape of your pyramid. The funeral temples and the temples are most often on what we call an axial plan, meaning that there is a center axis and that the buildings and even the layout of the overall structures is symmetrical along that axis. We can certainly see as we move into the New Kingdom that there same use of the composite view and of the proportional relationship and the hierarchical scale. This is a scribe, his wife, and their daughter, and of course the lower you are on the social spectrum, the smaller you're going to be in the image. But what's remarkable about this particular tomb painting is the way that the birds have been painted with such a high degree of naturalism. They really seem to even have specific individual. There's moths that are quite beautifully rendered. It's almost as if there's two styles happening at once. You have the naturalistic painting of the animals in marked contrast to this very formal, rigid, traditional format for painting human beings. This is also something important for us to be aware of. The technique of painting is similar to what we use in the Renaissance in Europe in mural painting. We refer to these as fresco paintings. They're plaster. The paint, however, in this case is not painted onto damp or wet plaster as it was in the Renaissance. This is fresco secco, or dry fresco, which would be appropriate in an arid desert climate where the humidity is not going to change and alter and cause much of the paint to flake off, which of course is what would happen in a place like Italy. We definitely also have a tradition continuing from the Old Kingdom into the new of the process of passing the soul on to the afterlife. And that, of course, was not a guarantee. Not every soul was going to continue, whether you were good or bad. In a Christian theology, a bad person's soul would continue to in hell. The Egyptians didn't really have that belief. You weren't going to make it into the afterlife at all unless you were judged worthy by the gods. And that's what's happening here. Papyrus scroll and a section thereof that depicts the judgment of the soul of Hunefer. And Hunefer is depicted multiple times. You see him here kind of pleading his case. He's at the top left. There we go. Mouse wasn't behaving. He's at the top left presenting his case to the gods. He's being escorted here by Anubis. Anubis is appearing again, adjusting the scales. This is Hunefer's heart, which than this feather, and therefore his soul is deemed light enough to continue. Thoth is there recording things this time, actually taking the notes literally, and then Hathor is presenting, or Horus rather, is presenting Hunefer to the god of the afterlife. So there again is Osiris and his wife Isis. So these types of documents, records, spells and rituals about death would have been present in earlier Egyptian art as well. They were in the pyramids as carvings and paintings. They continued on into the rock-cut tomb era as inscriptions on the mummy cases as well, and are now being produced in papyrus scrolls. So this is a long-standing tradition all throughout ancient Egypt. And you can see a variety of different compositional layouts, but with the And you see many of the same characters again, right? The demon creature that's ready to eat your soul if it's too heavy. There's the light heart and the feather that is heavier than the heart, allowing the soul to go on. So those are our books of the dead. Definitely want to remember the Temple of Horus as an example of our pylon facade temple to the gods, as opposed to a funeral monument for an individual pharaoh. Sunken relief in these as well, and you can clearly see that capital here that flares outward. Really beautiful structures. It's also kind of interesting to imagine what happens to Greek culture toward the latter period of Egyptian culture, rather, toward the end of the Egyptian era. We have Egypt being conquered by the forces of Alexander the Great. He installs one of his generals, who is Ptolemy, to become the new pharaoh. And so the ruling family of Egypt actually becomes genetically Greek, and that is the line that produces Cleopatra, who will ultimately be defeated by Romans, and then, of course, Egypt will formally become part of the Roman Empire. But once Egypt is part of Rome, it becomes this fascinating cultures. These are mummy case paintings that look like veristic Roman portraiture done with a type of paint we call encaustic. Encaustic is a beeswax-based paint, so it's pigment infused into wax. It has to be heated in order to be applied to wood. So it is a really durable paint. It retains its luster and its coloration, but it's really kind of jarring to see what appears to be a very Roman-style Egyptian funeral hieroglyphs. It's really kind of remarkable. But you get a sense of how fluid the ancient world was, how ideas from one culture could kind of flow into another. All of these are from the funeral structures at Fayum. Really pretty beautiful.